Hi there, my name is Caitlin, and I wanted to give a presentation today about managing stress and anxiety during uncertain times. Hi there. And this I know is, a topic that we've talked about a lot, and I think for many of us, we are going through all sorts of different anxious, stressful life circumstances, and it can be hard to kind of step back and think about, how do I cope with this? How do I manage this? And also just as a reminder of all of the resources that we as an EAP can provide you. So I wanted to kind of go through some topics and tips on how best to cope. Each person has their own experience and is feeling differently about everything. So this is really an overview that hopefully you can take away some skills and some strategies and a reminder of everything that we can offer you beyond just today's webinar. So I wanted to get started here. And one thing that has come up for a lot of folks, and when we think about stress, when we think about anxiety, and how, as it says on the slide here, uncertainty impacts us. So if we're thinking about anxiety specifically, and probably many of us are because we're feeling it, there is single incident and there's chronic anxiety. So our brains, our bodies are really kind of built to experience single incident anxiety. So that may be if you have a big work project that's due soon, have to take a test for class, something like that, where your anxiety is kind of building up until that point. But as soon as that thing is over, then that anxiety goes back down. So it's sort of like a bell curve. But what we are seeing here with, over 2 years of a pandemic and things constantly changing, and all sorts of other things happening in the world, we have this uptick in anxiety, but it just stays up at that heightened level. So we're in this state of chronic anxiety. And the challenge with that is that our brain, our body kind of can't go back into its calmer mode. We're just in this constant chronic state, and that can be exhausting, that can be challenging to cope with. The other thing is that when we are dealing with uncertainty, when we are dealing with change, one of the emotions that can come up a lot that we sometimes don't realize or notice is happening is we can experience grief. So if there's a change that happens in our life, and I'll talk to people about this when I'm talking about managing change, even if it's, whether it's a positive, neutral, or negative change, it is still a change for our system to go through and adjust to. And a grief reaction is common with that. And then on top of that, right now, a lot of what is happening and a lot of the uncertainty is very distressing, to say the least. And so we're dealing with anxiety, stress, possible grief reaction, and just this constant change. And it's hard to feel like we have a sense of resilience at this time. So if you're struggling with that, or if you're feeling like it's difficult to maybe access the coping skills you've used in the past, I promise you're not alone. And that also leads to us feeling kind of in this limbo state. When is this going to end? Will it end? Are things going to go back to the way they were ever? What will that look like? All of these questions that leave us in this state of not really having access to closure. And so we're in this ongoing process where I think for many of us, we've noticed over time now, how have I been coping? What's been working or not? But I think one of the main points that I want to kind of bring up throughout this presentation is one of the most important things, and there are many, but I think at the core of this is to think about what for myself is coming up for me. And like I'd mentioned earlier, all of us are experiencing this differently. So I'm not here to tell you how you feel, because all of us have our own feelings about things. So when we can practice more self-awareness of how am I feeling right now, and push through some of that avoidance, because I do think when we get uncomfortable, when we're exhausted, when we're burnt out, we tend to just avoid how we're feeling, because that also feels like work to sit with those difficult emotions. And some of what I will talk about today is how to do that more effectively, because although it seems stressful at first, practicing some of that emotional self-awareness can really help us feel more balanced. So if we're thinking about how do I notice how I'm feeling, it can be helpful to start looking at some symptoms. And this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some examples. You may look at these examples and say yes to all of them or no to all of them. Everyone's different. But when I talk to people and ask them, how are you feeling? How do you know you're feeling that way? Sometimes a person will tell me what their thoughts are. And that's, again, a big component of identifying how we're feeling and what's going on is the thoughts going on in our mind. But there's also the physiological experiences we're having as well as the behavioral ones. And sometimes we don't notice how our body, is really holding that anxiety. And I think, many of us may be aware of that level of muscle tension, or our breathing is more shallow, just that lack of balance, or calm in our body. But then mental, for a lot of this, we can go into imagining worst case scenarios. I think it's very easy, especially when there's something like a global pandemic, where it's hard not to get caught in, what if this happens? What if this happens? And that's our brain kind of going through that anxious spiral process. And it can be very difficult because the answer is to not think about it ever. We have to read the news. We have to think about making sure that we're following, guidelines of safety. So there's that balance of staying informed and staying educated, but not spiraling into worst case scenarios. So that, I think, for many of us can be this place that we need to find. And when we're in this anxious state, our brain will just start kind of going into spiral mode. And sometimes we can go into that behavioral. So if we're avoiding things that cause anxiety, doom scrolling, that is where, if you notice, and I think many people, when I talk to folks about this, will say that they do this as well. If you find yourself kind of just compulsively looking at social media, reading news, opening news apps every 2 seconds, and there's a point where we're not actually getting new information, we're just constantly reading all of this stressful information. And so setting some boundaries around that, because if we are just constantly being bombarded with this stressful information past the point of it being new and necessary for us to receive, it can create more of that anxiety. So when I think about, if I'm struggling with uncertain times, if I'm having anxiety, how do I notice that? And think about it in all of these 3 categories. And then if I suddenly was less anxious tomorrow, how would I notice that it happened? And I could ask any individual that and get a different answer. And so when I think about goal setting around, if I want to manage anxiety more effectively, if I want to communicate more effectively, whatever the goal may be, of what does success in that look like for me? And put that in a measurable space, because then there's steps to work towards, because coping with anxiety more effectively in and of itself is fairly vague. What does that mean for me? And I want to make sure that, a big takeaway here, like I mentioned on the earlier slide, is that this is individualized for each person, how it shows up for you, what coping skills work best for you. So some of this level of empowerment is actually just taking the time to think about, what do I need, and what do I personally, how would I notice that I was feeling better, and what steps do I need to take for myself? And that might look different for someone else. And that's completely normal. So start with, what you may be noticing. And as I go through all of this, this is just a starting point to start practicing self-awareness. I'll provide, and on every one of these slides, you can see contact information for EAP. There may be times where, you are thinking about coping skills, or you've tried things and you need extra support. That is what we're here for as well. So this is just one resource for you, and a whole list of other resources that the EAP provides. So if we're thinking about work specifically, and I've talked to a lot of teams, I've talked to a lot of individuals, folks in leadership, how is this showing up in the workplace? And workplace is different again for everyone. Some people work remotely, hybrid, or in the office or at the physical work location. It may have changed during the pandemic or not. Like, everyone's circumstances are unique. But what I see a lot, if there is this chronic anxiety, kind of like we talked about earlier, versus that single incident, when an individual, and then oftentimes a whole group of folks, are dealing with chronic anxiety, a lot of that can lead to burnout. There's only so long we can exist in this heightened state of anxious stress experience before our body starts to it's so exhausting. So what we might notice in both whether it's emotional or behavioral or social or mental. This is just a few examples of that. So what I have a lot of folks say is that they fall into kind of that apathy, which is very synonymous with burnout. It's hard to feel motivated anymore. It's hard to feel, to care anymore. If you're in a helping profession of any kind, that also can look like compassion fatigue. So it's hard to feel empathy towards others. There's only so much energy we can provide. Another thing that can come up often is if we're anxious, stressed, tired, because again, chronic anxiety impacts sleep. We can be more irritable. So that's another thing that sometimes people will say, I just can tell that when I'm more stressed, anxious, burnout, I'm more irritable. So that can be a kind of indicator or a point that you can look into of like, what are ways that I can kind of work on that or notice that more quickly. Social isolation, if we're feeling that stress, burnout, anxiety, we tend to isolate. Sometimes it's hard to ask for help, be vulnerable. Many folks will say, I feel like I have to just act like everything's fine. And in some ways, isolating more and just kind of trying to cope alone. But that can be really difficult over time. It's really hard not to feel like we are connected to others, our experiences are normalized and validated. And even if it's talking to a counselor, whatever that looks like, having that connection to other humans is really important. And just like on these other examples as well, just noticing some of those things that can show up at work. We are, again, trying to be very productive and doing all of our work the same way while everything is happening around us in the world. And a lot of folks will say, how am I supposed to do both of those things? Great question. It is not easy. And so some of it, we'll talk a little bit later about self-advocacy. So what are ways that you can ask for extra support at work, and what are some tangible things to actually do if you're feeling, like you're needing some help on a project or needing some support. And then when we are under added stress, our brain has a tough time concentrating as well. So when I talk later about some of the physiological coping skills, that's what can really help with that. Getting more grounded, getting more present in the moment. And also that helps with us when we become more balanced, we can start seeing things from multiple perspectives. A lot of times when we're in this constant state of anxiety because everything around us is uncertain, we like to have anything be certain, which can lead to inflexibility. Even some small change at work that wouldn't in the past have really triggered us or upset us is suddenly really upsetting us, because it's like, I just need one thing to go the way I expected it to, So that's a very understandable reaction. But if we're noticing that coming up, thinking, all right, I think that right now I'm in a space where I just need to practice some self-care, ask for some support, because I'm seeing this kind of showing up in these environments that isn't particularly productive. And sometimes I am asked, very understandably, what is the difference between stress and burnout? And one thing that's been notable, I think, during the pandemic and kind of during the last few years is a lot of this feeling of like fluctuating between them. So oftentimes, and nothing's 100% linear, but I would say that oftentimes we really go from stress to burnout is usually what I see. And that doesn't mean that's everyone's circumstance, and we can be kind of fluctuating between the two or back and forth or straight to burnout. But again, a lot of times stress is where we're overengaged, we're checking our email 24/7, we're doing 15 things at once, everything is urgent, we're just go, go, go. And we can feel really anxious, we're kind of just like in this state all the time. But that's very physically taxing. We just can't maintain that level of energy, and that then we kind of hit a wall. So a lot of times with stress and burnout, I think about, if at any point in your life, current or in the past, you felt burnt out, what were some early signposts to what led to that? And sometimes there are indicators of that, and kind of like I'll talk about here, like I mentioned before, some of that self-advocacy, or what are some things that could have helped me earlier on, and what's in my control that I could do. Because just like I had mentioned earlier with that, our tendency to avoid how we're feeling, we often will just kind of we're distracted by a million things, we're stressed, we're in nonstop go, go, go mode. We're not really paying attention to all those indicators of our brain, body telling us you're about to hit a wall of burnout. Then we hit a wall of burnout and we either get sick, we are completely disengaged. It's hard to be motivated to do anything. And then we're having to deal with kind of figuring out how to manage that. So a lot of times, and it's not to say that burnout is always inevitably preventable. There's a lot of things that can impact that. But sometimes there are ways earlier on that we can proactively, what I would say, proactive self-care, because we tend to be more reactive with our self-care. You know, I'll practice self-care once I have time, right? I hear that a lot. We won't have time until we schedule time. So I think part of it is reframing self-care as this isn't selfish, this is necessary for me to be my best self, you know, however I identify that, and avoid as much as possible getting to burnout. So noticing what your signs and symptoms are a little bit earlier, checking in on those, and then really proactively implementing some self-care strategies. And that's where that's going to look different for each person. But practicing that self-awareness of what we need and why can be helpful. Another thing I think can be helpful if we're trying to figure out what we need, because I've asked people before, what do you need? And they'll say, I don't even know. And sometimes that's where we're at. But what I like to do at that point then is have that person list, okay, tell me what your needs are emotionally, mentally, socially, physically, and narrow it down by categories that way. Because then sometimes it's like, you know what, I really need some help with some logistical stuff in this work project. That is a just logistical need that would be helpful. Or I realize I have a really difficult time coping with anxiety on an emotional level. I might need to talk to a counselor about some coping skills. So there's different ways that we can address those needs. So if you're not sure what you need, sometimes putting them or listing out your needs in those categories can help you sort of figure out what they are. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but especially with uncertain times, anxiety around that, and it's kind of related to when I was talking about that inflexibility, you know, one small thing that doesn't go the way I want. It's like, I need something to go this way that's expected. A big component of anxiety, because anxiety is really fear. You know, if we're talking about kind of just like our primal core emotional processes and how our body processes our environment and our physiological reaction to that, anxiety is fear. And at the core of fear, in almost all cases, is some level of a loss of control of something. So what happens is we are in this chronic state of having a lot of things that are not in our control. Global pandemic, all sorts of things in the world going on. So they are, of course, very important, and they are things that we have to think about. Another thing that's very important but not in our control is other people and how they behave and what they do. And those do, you know, other people impact us, circumstances impact us. But what we can sometimes do is feel very stuck in only thinking about what's important but not in our control. An example of that I hear a lot from folks is, I won't feel okay until this situation changes at work, outside of work, whatever the case may be. Or I won't feel okay until this person changes. So sometimes that person and or that situation will change. And then, you know, that happens, we go on about our day, our life. Sometimes that person or situation do not. And what happens is if we are telling ourselves, I won't be okay until, and then that thing or person never change, we're spending a lot of time waiting for something else to make us feel less anxious, feel happy. So we're really essentially externalizing our well-being. So what I think can be helpful is to focus on locus of control. Yes, there are things like situations, other people, world events that directly impact us. It's not that we don't think about those things. But if we are getting stuck in this sense of only kind of focusing on outside things are going to ultimately determine how I feel at any given time, bringing it back and thinking what is important and is in my control right now. Because regaining a sense of control, even a little bit, is what can shift that fear and anxiety, because that's what it is. So what is in my control? My ability to practice a breathing technique, my ability to communicate my needs effectively, my ability to set boundaries, my ability to ask for what I want in my workplace, how I regulate my emotions. And sometimes we don't focus as much on that important but in our control quadrant, like you see on the screen, because it's more work. It'll be like, that seems like a lot of work to practice setting boundaries. That seems like a lot of work to push through the anxiety of advocating for my needs at work. It'd be much easier if other things just change, you know what I mean, for the better for me. And that's our natural reaction. Our brain and body likes habit. It likes to just have things go the way it would like them to go. So that's very normal for us to have that experience. But it's pushing through some of that discomfort, and it's being willing to do some work around things that are in our control. And coping more effectively, communicating more effectively don't happen overnight. They are skills like anything else that we have to practice and learn. So it's not, I try to think about this too, because it can be very overwhelming to think, all right, so now I've got to figure out how to manage every emotion. Perfection is not the goal here. We're always going to have trouble certain times more than others at dealing with certain emotions, or an interaction that was triggering for us, and we realized later that we didn't react the way that we wanted to. That's being a human. So we're not looking for perfection here, but it's thinking about, even if I just practiced focusing more also on what is in my control right now. And it takes some time to convince our brain that that is better for us in those moments when we're spiraling in those worst case scenarios, or spiraling about what someone else did or said that was out of our control. When it's not productive, it's just that anxious spiraling. And our brain is like, but I really think this is what we need to be doing. I really think we should continue spiraling about this. And we have to set boundaries with our own selves and say, I know you're trying to help me, and you're doing your best as the brain and body to try to do what it thinks is best right now. But what we're going to do instead is a grounding exercise, or talk to a counselor, or just try something else that is back to something that is in our control. And it really does take doing that purposefully, and it's going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to feel like more work. Our brain is going to try to convince us that no, spiraling is better, and so kind of fighting through that urge to fall into our old habits. And it does take practice. But even just having this as a slide to remember, or even if you just wrote out these 4 quadrants, it's like, all right, I'm spiraling right now. What quadrant is that spiral about? Is it important or not important? Is it in my control or not my control? Wherever that falls, is there something I can do right now to kind of snap my brain out of that spiral that is in my control? So bringing it into kind of that locus of control mindset, I think, can be really empowering for us. And that really moves into what we think about when we're talking about resilience, because resilience is such a vague term. We hear it all the time, like, be more resilient. I want to be more resilient. Become more resilient. How do we teach people that? But if I were to ask folks, give me a working definition of that, I'll get a lot of different answers. So making it specific to you can be helpful. I would say, on this first bullet point is kind of a basic working definition that I have for that, of that capacity of folks to effectively cope, adjust, recover from stress or adversity. The main thing I would say too is that a lot of times we get stuck in thinking, I'm just this certain level of resilient and that's how I am. And I'll have a lot of people say, that's just how I am. I'm not very resilient, or I'm not very good at communicating, or whatever the case may be. But we can learn those skills. We are not just born with a certain level of resilience. And a core piece of resilience is the ability to tolerate distress. And so that takes practice. And that's where I think it goes back to that earlier information I was talking about with how do we actually measure success for ourselves? So how would I notice if I was suddenly more resilient? If I spoke to, everyone who's watching this right now, if you were suddenly more resilient tomorrow, how would things be different for you? And have those be as specific and measurable as possible. And then it also goes back to, we're not seeking perfection here. I think that can happen too. We get into very all or nothing thinking. I'm either resilient or I'm not. We want to step away from that type of thought process. So I would put it on a scale. If 10 is perfectly resilient, 0 not at all, where do I fall on that scale? The goal or expectation is not 10. We're going to fluctuate on that scale day to day, depending on the circumstances, how we're feeling. That's very normal. But if someone were to say right now on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put yourself on your resilience level? And you put yourself, say, at a 5, it's not how do I become a 10 out of 10? It's thinking if I was even just a 6 tomorrow, how would that look different? I think we sometimes underestimate the power of small changes in our life and small changes of how we do things, how we think about things, how we manage emotions, how we communicate. Very small things can have a big impact. So that also can take a lot of pressure off of ourselves of not having to be perfect. We're going to have good and bad days. That's okay. No one knows what they're doing right now because these are literally unprecedented times. We're doing the best we can. So even small things that you can do to take care of yourself. But I think a big piece of that is normalizing and validating that self-care piece, and that work not only helps us, but helps everyone else too. And so self-care, again, is not selfish. And I think that's a good reminder to always make sure to share. Diving a little deeper into resilience, because again, someone might say, I'm not even sure what that would look like. I just don't feel like I'm resilient right now. These are some examples of components of resilience. What I will say, in terms of optimism, I think sometimes optimism can be misinterpreted here. It definitely is not saying that the goal is someone's happy all the time, thinks every situation is perfect as it is, That is not what we're saying in terms of optimism being a goal, because that's not even possible. So what I would say, what optimism means under the umbrella of mental agility, is that when we are seeing circumstances through a more optimistic lens, what that means is I have this belief and understanding that I'm strong enough to get through this adversity. So that's different than I'm happy every time, I'm happy constantly, everything's perfect. That's not possible. That's not the goal. But it's kind of stepping away from some of those core beliefs we can get stuck in of you're never going to be able to cope with this. You're never going to be able to handle this effectively. That's that negative thought pattern. So mental agility helps us have more of a growth mindset. It's often a term that comes up rather than fixed mindset. So a big piece of that is seeing things from multiple perspectives. If we go into worst case scenario thinking, we're able to step back and say, that's one of many outcomes. So I'm going to start thinking about what are all the other outcomes of how this could go too. So that's what that mental agility piece means. With the self-awareness and that strength of character, this is where if we have any intention of coping with our emotions more effectively, we have to at least know what we're feeling. So paying attention to, being willing to notice your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, even if it's something where it's like, oh, I realize that when I feel this way, I don't communicate in the best way possible. That requires not only self-awareness, but self-accountability. And that can be very difficult for folks. So self-awareness is the first part. But then that strength of character, also a piece of that is the willingness and really the willingness to be self-accountable, that there are areas of growth that we are also working on. And there's things that we need to change too. And then to be able to overcome challenges, to receive feedback, all of that. And so it starts with self-awareness, and then that self-accountability piece is really crucial. Self-regulation is doing the work. If every time I feel anxious, I cope this way, and that's not really working for me, I want to learn how to regulate my emotions more effectively. And what I'll say with that component is that a lot of times I'll have folks say, I want to learn how to not have anxiety anymore. And never having anxiety again is not possible. We can regulate it down. We can learn how to essentially have a different relationship with it. And that's with all of our emotions. There's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. They are all just an energy in our body giving us signals of something that's going on. If we identify certain emotions as inherently bad, what our brain then sort of starts to create is this belief that it's not okay to feel them then, which makes sense. Like, that's bad, don't feel it. But the mental agility piece of thinking there are very uncomfortable emotions that we may not enjoy feeling, but they're not inherently bad. So that's where sometimes it takes a step back, because we can't regulate an emotion if we are just telling ourselves the only answer is to find out how to never feel this emotion. All that leads to is repression and avoidance. And usually what will happen when we're doing that, when we often don't even realize we are, is when I'll have people say, it's so hard for me to sleep at night because I'm just laying there overcome with all these emotions. Because when we repress, it doesn't actually go away. It just shows up when we don't want it to. So resilience comes from self-regulation, which a big piece of that, going back to an earlier thing I talked about, is distress tolerance. So what happens if I am willing to sit with the fact I feel anxious right now? And there's a concept called name it to tame it. And it sounds cheesy, but it's very accurate. If I'm willing to name the feeling I'm having, I automatically am no longer afraid of it, because when we have fear, we avoid something. So this is, again, regulatory emotional processes are not things that many of us have learned how to do. So if you're sitting there thinking, that sounds great, but how do I do that? I'll give you some quick tips here, but it can be a long process to learn those skills. And so, and not necessarily long, but there's, times where it may be working with a counselor, doing some extra work on that, because just like anything else, we have to learn how to do that. And then the last thing is that connection piece. I'd kind of touched on this earlier, but connecting to other people, feeling vulnerable, asking for help, seeking support is so powerful and so important. And remembering to intentionally try to make sure to maintain those connections with others, that really does reduce anxiety. All right, I had spoken earlier about self-advocacy. I feel very strongly about this. I think that a lot of times individuals will feel isolated. I was just talking about connection, stressed, burnt out, if we're thinking about the workplace specifically, and just feeling like I've got too much on my plate, or I'm feeling really stressed about this, or whatever the case may be. And I'll talk to many employees who say, I want to talk to my boss, or I want to talk about my needs. I don't really know how to, which is very understandable. But some suggestions I would have is how to go into that conversation with a more self-advocacy mindset. So I think about that through the statements versus solutions. So a statement would be, and it's not that one's right or wrong, it's just thinking, how can I go into this as being as productive as possible? So a statement would be something like, I'm feeling super burnt out right now. That's valid. There's nothing wrong with saying that. And if that's where you're at and you don't have a solution to that in mind, that's okay. But if you are thinking about, I want to go talk to my supervisor, advocate for some of my needs, thinking about, okay, if I recognize I'm burnt out right now, what would be some things that might help me with that? So this is where some of these solution-focused statements can be helpful. Here's one thing that would help me feel less stressed at work. I would love to have my lunch hour moved from this hour to this hour. Is that possible? How would you like me to prioritize my tasks? Right now I have this many tasks on my plate, trying to make sure I can get all of them done. It would be helpful to know how you'd like me to prioritize them, or what those time frames are. One thing that would help me feel less stressed right now is if I had someone helping me on this one project. These very measurable, tangible, ideally, reasonable suggestions. Not saying that all of them are going to be possible, but what it does is, not only does it allow you some space to actually think about what would help with this right now for me, and then it also creates a more productive conversation with the workplace of, I'm going in with a solution in mind. Is that possible? Sometimes it is. If not, what's an alternative option that we can talk about? So this is something I think can be important and helpful, because I do think a lot of folks, very understandably, it can be anxiety inducing to say that we're struggling with something. It can be anxiety inducing to ask for what we need, to identify that, to talk to a supervisor, to have those conversations. But sometimes starting with this type of language can help just kind of keep it in the, here's an idea I have, would that work? So that's a piece that I like to always talk about with coping with anxiety, especially during uncertain times, because I just have so many folks say they're feeling stressed and kind of isolated. And the actual just act of advocating for ourselves in and of itself oftentimes can reduce that anxiety. We're just being honest about what we need. And one thing here, I'll say, I think all of us know this at this point. The only constant is change, if you will, and that's a very, old term all of us have heard. But this goes back to locus of control. I won't feel okay until everything's just stopped being constantly uncertain. I understand. But a lot of times we can plan everything out perfectly, and as we all know very well, then one other thing happens and everything changes again. So it goes back to, how do I practice resilience in uncertain times instead of I won't feel okay until they're certain again. So one thing that can be helpful is remembering dialectics, because we oftentimes compare ourselves to others, as we all know. So I'll have someone say, I don't understand why, my coworker, for example, seems to be like handling this all fine and I'm really struggling with it. What's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. So everybody copes differently. Everyone has their own way that they're handling stress. Everyone has different things in their life that are coming up. So dialectics means two things can be true at the same time. We can both be experiencing the same world events, but have very different reactions to them. And, I know for a lot of folks, they're interacting with coworkers, for example, and there's different opinions and different experiences. One, for example, is if you're in a circumstance where your team was working remotely and then it's going back into an office space. Everyone has different opinions about that. Some people might be really excited, some people might not be, some people might be kind of neutral on it. And some people might be really excited to have this like social interaction. For others, more introverted, less so. And that's everyone's own truth, so how we respect ourselves, respect other people during these uncertain times is really important. And then identifying our own patterns. How have I handled change in the past? What worked and what didn't? What coping skills did I use in the past that were effective? Are there some of them that I haven't been kind of practicing for a while that I could start using again? And also, what is my underlying reason that I want to cope more effectively? And that sounds counterintuitive because it seems like someone would just say, don't we all want to? But sometimes it can be kind of like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of work, So we may have underlying barriers, again, our brain and body is like, well, we've just been doing it this way the whole time. Can we just keep doing it this way? But finding some intrinsic motivation behind why we want to make changes is very powerful. So even just thinking about, why for myself do I want to, say, for example, regulate my emotions more effectively, cope with anxiety more effectively? For me specifically. So that intrinsic motivation is going to help maintain changes that we want to implement for that self-care piece. All right, so there's a 3-step relaxation activity. There's also a 2-step version. So I'm just going to show you the 3-step version really quickly. So literally all this is you just close your eyes, you drop your shoulders, and you relax your face and jaw. The 2-step version of that is you just wouldn't close your eyes. So if we're thinking about emotion regulation, checking in with our, brain and body, a lot of times when we think about self-care, we assume it's going to be this very time-consuming thing, this whole activity. But I would argue that some of the most powerful self-care comes from just in the moment, checking in with what you need and regulating down your system. And something as quick as that 3 or 2-step version of that, if you're watching this and you did that right then, noticing how much tension was I holding? And if you did it again in 10 minutes, you may notice that tension came back. But even just allowing ourselves that quick kind of physiological, moment of relaxation is very powerful. So a few other things that you can try, and there's square breathing. So there's a lot of different breathing techniques that you can do. Square breathing can be really helpful because it balances out your breath. It also gives your brain something to do, because sometimes I'll have people say, I tried deep breathing, but I didn't really like it because my brain was still spiraling in those thoughts. So square breathing is just, you just have all 4 parts of your breath take the same amount of time. So the pause before you breathe in, the breath in, the pause before you breathe out, and the breath out. And you can have that be 3 seconds, 4 seconds, whatever's closest to your natural breath rhythm. And what that's also doing is it's having your brain have to remember what step you're in, counting those out. Instead of just still spiraling and trying to breathe. Sometimes people will say that deep breathing didn't work for them. A lot of times it's because they were still shallow breathing. So square breathing can help you balance that out. This link to guided imagery is one of thousands out there. If you just go on Google and search guided imagery, guided meditation, you will find unlimited options. And a lot of those can either be like something like progressive muscle relaxation, where it's someone just guiding you through the relaxation steps for all of your muscle groups. Other ones, it's something where it's more of that guided imagery where it's like, imagine you're sitting next to a stream watching the leaves float down. And it sounds cheesy, but literally anything you can do to give your brain something else. Because when we tell ourselves just don't think about it, we're going to think more about it. So if you're trying to fall asleep and it's like, stop spiraling about this thing, it's going to keep spiraling until we give our brain something else to do instead. So sometimes that guided imagery can kind of snap our brain out of that spiraling. There's pressure points. So there's the website, the Tapping Solution. You can also download their app, and that shows you different physiological pressure points that can help regulate down your system. Taking up space can help. So if you are feeling stressed, anxious, kind of in that, spirally, buzzing state, it can help to just move around or take up space. And that doesn't have to be like exercise, but just literally just stand up or just walk around. When we're feeling anxious, we tend to inherently take up less space, kind of that fetal position mentality. And we don't even realize we're doing it. You may be working at a desk all day and realize you're just like taking up less and less space. So standing up, taking up some space can really be very helpful. Slowing down as well. When we're feeling anxious, we talk fast, we move fast, we do everything quickly, and that gets our body into that spirally mode. So even that 3-step or that 2-step relaxation can help with that. Of like, I've just been going into, over engagement mode here. I'm going to bring it back for a second and slow down. And that helps us respond to our environment versus react. When we are very anxious, we're in that fight, flight, freeze mode. We become very reactive. We don't think before we do things. It's hard to concentrate. It's hard to be present. So any type of breathing technique, checking in with our 5 senses, any of this physiological grounding helps create some space between stimulus and response. So we can move away from, oh, I just responded to that email, not in the way I wanted to, how could I have created some space before going into reactivity mode? Because then it becomes this kind of feedback loop of then that email we regret sending caused more anxiety, and now we're more spiraling, So doing something small to kind of help ourselves become more present for a moment and be more in a space of responding to our environment. And again, that takes practice. We do the best we can, but even small little things can really make a big impact. So just a quick final slide here. I think we know all of these things, but just as a quick reminder, it is, like I said, I don't want to say everyone, but a lot of folks are struggling, very understandably so. And we're doing the best we can. We're not striving for perfection here. Of course, always make sure you're getting information from reliable sources. Kind of like I was talking about earlier, we can start doom scrolling or spiraling about things. So not only getting information from reliable sources, but, setting boundaries with how often we are going on social media or checking the news. And focusing again on what is in my control right now, even something as basic as your breathing technique. That if you're feeling stressed, anxious, all of those things, that is very understandable and normal. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just figuring out how to take care of yourself. And, staying connected to folks and really, again, like I mentioned before, that proactive self-care, trying to move into how do I regularly take care of myself, and rather than waiting until I've hit that wall of burnout. And so that does not mean that it's super time consuming. It can literally be, I'm going to try that 3-step relaxation once a day for the next few days and see what happens. Like that is 5 seconds of your day, and then moving up from there. So measurable, reasonable expectations for implementing anything. Like I said before, I can't say this enough, even small changes make a really big difference. And so the last thing we need is more stress about adding in a bunch of complex self-care. So small things can go a really long way. So just remembering you're not alone. Just about everyone's struggling. Each person's unique in the circumstance, and just focus on what do you need right now. So whatever you need, we can help you with that. You aren't alone. We, as your employee assistance program, are completely confidential. We're also a completely free benefit. So if you need any type of services like counseling or other kind of services like legal or financial coaching, we have tons of resources for you. And I really hope that you always, remember that you can access our services. You can text us, you can email us, you can call. That phone number is also 24/7. So if you need to talk to a counselor immediately for any reason, 24/7, 365, you have access to do that. So you definitely are not alone. You have tons of resources that you can access through us. And so if you have any questions about our services or want to set any of them up, please don't hesitate to contact us. And I hope that today was a helpful, just kind of reminder, starting point of how to bring it back and think about what you need, that you're not alone in this process. It's extremely stressful right now. And just focus on, what you need to do to take care of yourself, and know that we are here to support you through that process as well. So thank you so much for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.